Hello, I'm Jonathan Crocker of Theater on the Ground and the Wyld Men, and welcome to the Renaissance History Podcast presented by the digital Ren Faire. And I'm here joined today by Carl Asch.
Or Giacomo the Jester. And I have been performing at fairs for quite a long time as Giacomo the Jester, as Double Indemnity, a Celtic music band, Empty Hats, a Celtic music band, Tip the Velvet as a music band, also a knife-throwing show, and now as the announcer for my son's show, The Daring Horseman. I'm exhausted just thinking about it.
Man, I need to go back and do my intro with more enthusiasm. Well, it's good to be here, Carl. Let's talk.
Nice to be here. Thanks. I love the fact that the Renaissance fairs began in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And it makes so much sense because the 60s was the Renaissance coming out of the 50s. The 50s was such an age of conformity, of black and white. Mm-hmm. And then the 60s were the rebirth of culture and art and music and experimentation. And that's what the Renaissance was. So it makes perfect sense that the 60s would give birth or rebirth to the Renaissance Festival. It's why, there are now medieval festivals, mm-hmm. which aren't very different than Renaissance festivals.
Right.
The garb is a little different in the monarchs. I don't have a different costume for the most part, but I like the mythology of the Renaissance more than I like the mythology of the Middle Ages.
Right.
And again, it's just the mythology. It's just the mythology, So I've always been struck by that. There's a movie, Pleasantville. All of it's in black and white.
Right.
Until something happens, and then
Until Don Knotts fixes the TV.
And then it's in color. Because the movie Pleasantville is what happened to the 50s when the 60s happened. And all of a sudden it was in color. And that's what the Renaissance was, and that's what the Renaissance Fair is. I always say, and I say this in my tours, if I were to distill what I know about the Renaissance, which is not a hell of a lot. I'm not a scholar by any means, but I always say that the Renaissance began in the Pitti Palace, where the Medicis lived, and at Cosimo de' Medici's dining room table, when he was probably having a little too much grappa with his friends, and he uttered those immortal words, "Screw the Pope." And the Renaissance began, because that's what was required.
Going to play by the medieval rules anymore.
Right, and the Pope was his cousin, and they didn't get along very well. And the Renaissance began. I call that reductionist history. If I distill it all down, that's what, And on the tours, we go to that dining room table, so it makes for a fun story. So,
yeah. But that is an interesting observation. Not that the 50s were the dark ages per se, but it was a time of very widespread cultural repression on many different political repression, cultural, sexual, social,
artistic,
yeah.
Racial,
yeah. And there's we've mentioned this before too. The book Well Met that talks about the cultural history of Renaissance festivals in America. Amy Rubin, the author, talks about the interplay that it's not just the Renaissance Fair sort of came out of the 60s, but in many ways, many things that we come to associate with the 60s actually came out of the Renaissance festivals.
Oh, that's interesting.
That there were musicians in Southern California that had no place to exhibit their geekhood. They were really interested in cultural, in ethnic music, and there weren't any, venues that they could bring that out. And then they met each other, and there were all these cross-pollinations that occurred. And so the whole sort of world music thread that began in the 60s actually was fostered and sort of brewed up in the Renaissance festivals.
Interesting.
Or specifically the Southern California and Northern California fairs.
Huh.
And the sort of the craft movement that flowered in the 60s, the craft revival, Renaissance festivals were an early marketplace for people who had that interest. And allowed a lot of people to actually make the break and create a livelihood that way. Where otherwise they might not have been able to. And so there was a whole lot of interplay between festivals and the larger cultural movements that were going on.
I remember meeting the first year at Scarborough. I met a guy, Miles, who was one of the original Bald Mountain Moccasin guys. And he was a corporate engineer And one day he had gone to a Renaissance festival and loved leather and boots and stuff. And he got up he tells the story of going up in the elevator to his office. The door opens up. He stood there, let the doors close, went back down and walked out. And he never went back and started one of the founders of Bald Mountain Moccasins. Renaissance festivals are such an anomaly for performers, as both of you know. One, if I perform at a folk festival, which I've done, I don't care how well you do, you're not going to be there the next year because that's not their business model.
Right.
Maybe 5 years they'll
Cycle you back.
cycle you back, you know. But Renaissance fairs are the only festivals I've ever heard of, really, where, how long have you been at this one?
This is my 32nd season at the Ohio Renaissance Festival.
You know,
I'm only at 29.
Here's what you have to look forward to, you know. Yeah.
I'm only at 29 in Arizona.
Oh, okay. You know, and same here, 30, probably close to 30 years at Sterling. And the audiences like to see the same show year after year. It's a real connection. Two other things that I've always felt about Renaissance fairs is that what makes Renaissance fairs work more than Wild West shows or Civil War reenactment or whatever. Renaissance fairs are a tarot deck come to life.
Huh.
We are myth. If we're not myth, we're not doing our jobs. And so that's what we have to create our card, so to speak. You know.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor or a great analogy.
I had an idea years ago for Chiara, who was a tarot reader at festivals, that I thought would be really cool. Instead of people going to her booth and her shuffling the deck and her laying out 10 cards, that people would come through the gate and every person they met along the way, they would give them a card, you know, and that would be their spread. And they would get to her booth, lay out 10 cards, and that's who she would read. So we were, again, the living tarot deck. Too complicated to do.
Yeah,
but in the screenplay version, we'll make that work.
I like to liken it to like a pop-up book. Children like to read their same pop-up book over and over again because they know who the characters are on each page and they know their story and things, but they still want to see them. They still want to hear the story and have it read to them and everything and engage with that. But it's like, it's the same picture every single time. And every single time coming to a Ren Faire as a child, like I would see the same people over and over again. And I remember seeing consistently the same people in the same costume and being able to remember just that. Because at Renaissance fairs, it's overtly stimulating. Everything. You see too many things, right? And if you can remember 5 things out of it, and as a performer, my goal is to try and be one of those 5 things that somebody remembers.
Sure.
Because they're only going to remember, like, maybe that, right? Like, is just too much going on. And if you can be one of those things, that's a...
When I pitch Empty Hats, my band, to festivals, one of the things that I say is, your guests, when they leave, they're going to remember 3 things mostly. The Queen, the Joust, and Looney Lucy. Those are the 3 things they're going to remember more than anything else. And they're like, yeah, you're right. Okay. You're on. You know, so, because she is such a memorable character.
I like how the festival environment encourages such strong character. As a performer, it's a great balance of subtlety and going over the top,
right?
You know, but there's a subtlety to be able to go over the top,
right?
And
right,
still maintain connection.
Absolutely, you know? Not everybody can do that, and Looney Lucy can really do that. She can be charming and filthy at the same time. And if you're filthy without the charming, you're out. You're out.
Yeah.
The other things that's anomalous about Renaissance fairs, from having done this for so long, and I'm sure you've had this experience, so I'll just give you my stories about it, and I'm sure you will have them, or if you haven't already. But to so be the fabric and history of a family's life is such an honor and so humbling. A number of years ago in Pennsylvania, I saw this woman that we had seen for years, knew her parents. I saw her through 2 husbands, every year, see what happens in their lives.
Right.
And I said, I haven't seen your folks this year. Is everything okay? And she said, no, my dad is dying and he doesn't have the strength to come here anymore. He always loved the band. He always bought all of our CDs. And I said, you know what? We'll come to him. And we did. And we came one night to their house and we literally played on his deathbed. And he died 2 days later.
Wow.
And she came, she gave us all pins and stuff. And she said he never stopped talking for the next 2 days about you guys coming to him and playing for him. And so to be a part of a family's history is so beautiful. In my solo Giacomo show, I walk a rope and I tie it to a post on one end or a tree trunk on one end, 6 guys on the other, 6 big guys, and 1 little girl holding the other end of the rope. And I get on it and juggle torches. Mm-hmm. And I've done it for 30 years, And about 5 years ago at Sterling, I'm packing up the show and the family of the little girl who I had picked to hold the rope, they came up and her mother was like, I'm so glad you picked my little girl because 20 years ago, you picked me. And I'm crying. I'm like, did she remember this? That this was that strong a memory for them? And then to do that, I mean,
right.
I often think about in my life of how does one measure a life well lived? And that would definitely have to be one of the earmarks, is that just being able to have that and to have people say, because of the band and music that, we played Beggars to God at our wedding and that was our first dance. Or, my mother passed away and she wanted to hear Beggars to God at her funeral, and we hear this stuff all the time. And, and I'm sure the Rolling Stones get stuff like that, but they don't get to hear it personally very often.
Right.
They're a little bit farther removed. And I love that. I mean, I love that they're right there. I started many years ago as Giacomo the Jester, and I did a show of magic, juggling, rope walking, and extremely obnoxious behavior. And then I met Frank O'Gara at Trump's Castle. We were both performing for who would later become our president. And we started the Double Indemnity knife throwing show. He also played guitar. And so we started singing and playing together. And then we formed a band called Double Indemnity as an offshoot of the knife throwing show.
There probably aren't very many bands that have been an offshoot of a knife throwing show.
No. We used to say knife throwing is just our day job. We're really minstrels, So when I first started doing Renaissance festivals, I was a classical guitarist. I had studied classical guitar in New York City at the American Institute of Guitar. And I sort of looked around and I went, yeah, I'm never going to play music at a Renaissance fair because at the time, nobody really paid attention. It was all pretty much background music. So I was doing these shows, these variety shows, and I was getting audiences and making hat money and blah, 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 blah. But I wasn't going to play music at them. Then also I was working at Trump's Castle and somebody had given me a cassette tape, just to let you know the time frame. And I got on my bicycle and I put in this cassette tape.
On your Walkman.
On my Walkman, right, absolutely. Put on my headphones and my Walkman. I'm playing this cassette tape. And all of a sudden I start crying. This was Silly Wizard, Andy M. Stewart singing these incredible songs. And I realized these are the songs my voice was meant to sing. So Frank and I started doing this music at the Poconos Renaissance Festival. Brian Belge, Dennis Johnson.
Right.
Also only lasted 2 years. But it was really great. That was where the knife throwing show was for the first time. And, we were playing music mostly, to meet women. And so we would just walk around and play music. And then one day, so this is when I realized that this music sort of meant something. One of the characters at the Poconos, the Merry Widow, she's sitting on a picnic bench. There's a couple of people milling about. And she says, "Oh, goodly minstrels, mayhaps you would play a goodly song for us." And we launched into a song, kind of a sad song called "If I Was a Blackbird" by Silly Wizard. And at the time, I would close my eyes, sing the song, and I wouldn't open my eyes until I was done with the song. I get done with the song, I open my eyes, and there's 40 people around us. And the woman that asked us to play the song was gone. And they're clapping, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's nice. And I was like a little irked that she was gone. I was like,
you didn't stick around?
What, really? You asked us to play a song? You don't want, And then I ran into her later on, and she said, "I'm so sorry. I had to leave." There I was in my silly little character, and that song was just too real. I couldn't stay in character and listen to that.
It's powerful.
That was, it was really powerful. Yeah, again, it was just Frank and I walking around playing, singing songs, And because it was just the two of us, we didn't have to sing things like "Roll Your Leg Over," and we didn't have to sing "Drunken Sailor." We'd sing whatever the hell we want. And people really, really liked it. All the vendors started going, "Where's your cassette?" Giving us money so we could make a cassette. We're like, "No, what do you, we're knife throwers." And our first cassette, done in Frank's basement was called "Double Indemnity Minstrel Knife Throwers, Songs That Get You in the Heart." And it was a heart on a knife throwing target with a knife in it, and the stem and the flag of a note coming off of the heart. And that was our first cover, "Songs That Get You in the Heart." And what was funny, by the time we released our second album, it had to be on cassette and CD. And then by the time we released our third one, it could only be on CD. Talk about a golden age. That was the 90s. You'd get done with a set and what? $600 in CD sales? Oh, believe me, I'm going that to myself. Victoria's giving me the finger. I'm sorry that you were not born then. I'm sorry.
Houses and cash, man. That's why there's no dulcimer players on the road now.
Oh, yeah.
That's my theory.
But yeah, that was really something.
So we went from Double Indemnity on to...
So then after Double Indemnity, I think 5 years and 3 albums, Frank decided to quit and sue me. And so that split up Double Indemnity, and then Linda Cavey and Gary Mazu and I and whatever fiddle player we work with at any given time. We are the revolving fiddle player band.
Okay.
So we became Empty Hats, and we have been Empty Hats since 2000, so 22 years ago.
Wow. Amazing how those numbers add up.
Whew. Yeah. And 7 albums ago, and 7 albums. I have 4 solo albums. It has been just a fabulous life. Pennsylvania has an incredible Kids Day. They have a lot of Kids Days. And they have the best Kids Days of any festival ever.
Really?
Because they prepare their kids, or at least they did. I don't know if they still do. But they go in with materials to all the schools that are coming. And there are competitions that the kids do on their Kids Day. There's a Shakespeare competition. There's a madrigal competition. There's a poster art competition. There's a writing competition. There's like all of these competitions. And they're also given these materials to ask different, they have to ask a vendor, they have to ask a performer, they have to ask all of these people, what do you do? And one of the questions that they always ask is, what class are you? I've always been struck by that. And so my answer is, my stock response is, I'm of a class they're not telling you about.
Oh.
I'm of the artist's class. And that means I don't have a lot of money, but I get to travel all over the world. And sometimes I travel in carriages. And sometimes I travel in a hay wagon. And sometimes I sleep in castles. And sometimes I sleep in a barn. But I get to go all over the world. And I don't need to have a lot of money. And doesn't happen often, but every now and then some kid will be like, I get that. And then I realized I've ruined one more life. It's like there's a meme somewhere. I don't know if I'll get this absolutely correct, but, give a man a song, he might spend money for a day. Teach a man to play a song, he'll be poor the rest of his life. And that's how I've spent my life. I don't make a lot of money, and I don't need a lot of money. I point to my van and go, Caleb, one day all this will be yours. But it's been a hell of a life. It's been a phenomenal life. I feel very blessed.
Yeah, there was a year, it must have been 91, something like that.
At Scarborough?
At Scarborough. Doug Konjolka and Jose and Doug Muma and Dave Woolley, they both had a sword fighting act at the festival.
Right.
They were in different places. So they were kind of the rival sword fighters, but they, by definition, never really encountered each other.
Right.
But they all were of the same, sort of background of sword fighters and stage combat aficionados.
Sure.
So they talked a lot in their off time about what they did, and they thought, maybe we should try to do a real Renaissance era stage combat with like blood packs and animal guts, which is what they did. I mean, Shakespearean combat. They'd go right to the slaughterhouse for their special effects. And so the idea evolved to become a competition between the performers who played at the Crown stage and those who were in the Hollyfield. And with one of those teams at each of those places sort of being the core combatants, and ultimately it being evolving into a duel between Don Juan and Dirk Perfect, the two number ones, with everybody else dying before I got to them in their own various gruesome ways. It became a thing over the course of the run of the fair as we practiced it, and it got, the vendors got word of it and fans got word of it. And when it finally occurred, it was the largest stage performance that I ever saw.
Wow.
Which at the time, I mean, I've seen bigger audiences since then.
Right, of course.
But there probably were about 1,000 people there. And we realized that we were probably past the hat. And had to decide what to do with the money. And at that time, John O'Connor was living up in Minneapolis. And he had a friend who had a personal tragedy and a huge amount of expenses to cover. And we said, well, let's just donate the proceeds to that person. Turns out the personal tragedy was that her boyfriend was actually knifed and died, and she was trying to cover the funeral expenses. So there was this deep-baked irony.
Well, let's just help her out with a sword fight.
Right, with a lot of blood.
Oh man!
So like there was no overlap. She was not there, and we didn't tell the audience what that was about. But for everybody participating, there was this kind of really macabre aspect to how we were handling everything. And it was the largest hat that I ever experienced at that time. And did help her out quite a bit.
And that 1,000-person, you were not amplified.
No.
So amplification and the allowing of amplification is probably one of the biggest changes.
Absolutely.
That Renaissance
we could go on about that.
We can go on about that. And I don't, I'm not a fan.
Mm-hmm.
I do it because you have to now.
Yeah.
But I'm not a fan. I wish it didn't have, but now we're getting larger audiences. Right. And so even Sterling allows that now, which is only in the last 5 or 6 years, maybe. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't. Even for the knife throwing show here, we'll get, and I just don't like it.
What changes for you?
When I use microphones?
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm connecting as much. And maybe it's because I've never done it enough. And I would be able to connect if I did it more, if I felt that connection more. I don't like the way it sounds when I'm in the audience. I don't like it when I'm talking over here and they're hearing it over here and over here.
Right.
It just feels weird to me.
Yeah, I resisted it for a long time as well, and for some of the same reasons. But especially that sense, the analog aspect of it is like, of being actually connecting physically. The vibrations that I am producing are actually connecting directly with the audience,
right?
And it's kind of esoteric and subtle,
right?
But there is a sense that is an actual physical connection that you're making, right? And when it's processed through electronics and then comes out from somewhere else, there is this intermediary that removes that sense of really directly.
And the illusion, of course, is somewhat lost.
It's one more thing for the audience to have to sort of process away.
Right, to suspend their disbelief on.
Yeah, exactly.
I always think that one of the things also that makes Renaissance festivals so popular and so attractive, I remember the Saturday after 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so
I don't know what festival you were.
I was here in Ohio.
You were here.
Yeah.
It was packed.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you had it here, but that was the largest day Pennsylvania had ever had at that point.
Yeah.
It was huge. And what it felt like, and there was this urgency about it, and it felt like they didn't want to just be somewhere else. They wanted to be somewhen else.
Yeah.
They needed to be not in 2001. They just needed to be somewhen else.
Yeah.
And that's what we provide. And I remember having a huge argument with Chuck Ramito, who was the owner at the time, where at the end of that Saturday at the pub sing, he trotted out the American flag. And I was like, oh, dude. Yeah, you're going to get that response, but why do you need to get, you don't need that. That was a powerful day. I remember some of the actors in the cast, they were like, oh, I'm just too distraught. I can't do it. I can't do it. And I said to them, well, you need another job. Because this is in fact our sacred responsibility.
Yeah.
This is our job. We've been training for this day.
We're going over the top, soldier.
That's right.
We're going to bring merriment and laughter and peace to these people who really need it.
Not. I know. I mean, and that is our sacred responsibility.
Absolutely.
I don't think I'd ever felt more duty bound in my job than on that day.
I agree.
And so I told him, I said, if you can't do it today, you need another gig.
Yeah. I remember walking on stage and having this sense of, it was like a balloon bursting. Like there was this sense of suspense. Like 9/11 was a Tuesday.
Yes.
And we went on Saturday. And nobody had laughed in 5
days.
In 5 days.
Right.
And what we were going to do or what was going to happen. And we went on and did our show as
exactly.
usual.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, almost as usual.
You can't make reference to it.
We were missing somebody because you couldn't get out of Florida because he has a whole visiting family. So we had to have a 2-person version of the show. But nonetheless, we did what we were there to do.
Okay.
And we produced the comedy that they were there for. And the laughter, the joy was just explosive in a way that I can't even describe. There's almost desperation.
Yes, absolutely.
But it was like whatever the other side of the coin of desperation is, they were
exhaling.
And just releasing. Yeah, the sense of release. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really, really powerful.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful weekends ever.
May it never happen again.
May it never happen again.
And the pandemic was too long of a drawn-out experience to have allowed for, and when we came back, there was like some.
It was definitely a close second, I would say.
The job, but it was like there were parts of it that were still so painful in the execution of it.
I didn't. My first fair was here in Ohio in the fall of 2021 last year.
Mm-hmm.
So there had already been a lot of opening up, people getting used to the idea of coming back out and among people. So when the fair opened, the overwhelming feeling that I felt was of this real urgency to get back to normal, and normal being what they experienced at the fair. It wasn't the same sense of explosive energy that we felt it on that first Saturday after 9/11, but there was definitely that sense of expectation and excitement.
It was a welcome home.
It was
a welcome home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And pent up expectation, and need for that kind of release and entertainment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So I certainly felt that throughout the season last year.
Yeah, my first one back, and it was disjointed because my first one back was Sherwood. But they were still very strict. Yeah, in Texas, outside of Austin.
Yeah.
And we still had to wear masks, though.
That was spring of 2020.
Yeah. No, they were open spring of 2020, but then they closed in the middle.
So this is spring of 2021.
So spring 2021,
right.
We still had to wear masks. We couldn't bring people on stage. They were still social distancing people in the audience.
Right.
It didn't feel like a welcome home. It wasn't until probably May exploded. It was huge. The crowd was huge.
The sheer number of patrons, the increase in interest in going to Renaissance Fair, which is an outdoor event, has definitely increased in your experiences here as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And again, that sense of let's get away from the divisiveness in the country. Let's get away from where we are now. Because, there was no divisiveness in the Renaissance.
I think there is something to that. There's something that I appreciate and feels is valuable. And part of our choices as comedians within this milieu is to not make contemporary references and not make those accessible jokes that one could, in order to allow a space where people who are vastly different in their opinions can come together and laugh at the same thing.
Right.
And although it may not be something that people are consciously thinking about when they're doing it, I do feel that there's, if there's something important about what I do, that is a component of bringing people together who can at least on some level perceive that, like, the person sitting over there has a Trump shirt or something that identifies them as liberal or whatever it is, and see that, I'm with people who I would otherwise perhaps not think I have anything to share with.
Sure.
We are sharing this and experiencing that together. And I think that's a healing space to create.
Well, one of the things that I always felt was magical about doing what I do, if I'm successful at it anyway, is to take 200, 300, 400, 500 people and make them one audience.
Yes.
And that's magical to me.
Yes.
When people will all erupt at the same time or all go at the same time. When I was a kid, I used to go to movies and I would sit in the front row and watch the audience. I loved watching the audience. If I got bored with the movie...
See, that's why you have this job, because you get to watch audiences all the time.
That's correct, and that's what I figured, I love that unification.
Relate, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that I realized a number of years ago, I saw an old black and white TV show, Wild Wild West. I don't know if you remember this.
Oh, yeah.
And it was Adam West in the Wild West, and he was like FBI in the 1800s, and
he's Secret Service,
yeah. And he lived on a train that went across the country. Cool. And I went, that's why I live in a bus. It's because of that. Because I was going, that is the coolest thing ever. That and a book by Hermann Hesse. A book by Hermann Hesse is really why I do what I do. Narcissus and Goldmund. Narcissus and Goldmund is about a medieval traveler. And I read the book when I was 18 and left the next day.
Wow. That was quick.
Yeah. I literally...
It was like the elevator moment.
That was it. Yeah. I left. I just started hitchhiking. I grew up in a suburb of New York City near Route 80.
Okay.
And because of that, Route 80, San Francisco was just down the street. was one road. Route 80 went from New York to San Francisco. I didn't need a map. I just got onto Route 80 and stuck my thumb out.
You're not the only one.
No, of course not.
Renaga, Renaga Fabiars, he makes wind chimes and sells beads. He did this like
really
when like the Summer of Love happened. He was like got on Route 80, just like stuck out his thumb. And
that's it. Right. That was all. That was it. So I read Narcissus and Goldman, and I went, all right, I'm a traveler. And I realized I didn't, about maybe 10, 15 years later, and I'd been now performing as a Renaissance traveler for quite some time. And I'm, Barnes and Noble or something, and I see a new version of the book, and I go, oh my God, I look like him. I literally have created my life, and my hair was like that. I was like, all right. I invented this life from, a Jewish kid in New Jersey to a medieval traveler. That's what I became. When I started doing my show in Central Park, that was where I debuted my Giacomo the Jester show in Central Park in New York City. And then I got this gig at the World's Fair. I got the gig at the World's Fair with probably the coolest promotional thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
A World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee, 1982. And I wanted this job so bad. And they had wandering performers around the festival that would do shows for the food lines, for the exhibit lines, and just to do street shows. And I'm perfect for that job,
Right.
I wanted it so bad and wanted to be an international traveler. So this was perfect for me. And so I call him up, and this guy, Scott Tillery, says, yeah, send us your video. We'll take a look at it. We'd love to. And I'm like, okay.
I have to make a video.
A video? I don't have the money to make a video. What is he kidding? I didn't really have a show.
What did a video cost in those days? If you were going to make
I have no idea. Whatever it was, I couldn't afford it.
Hundreds, thousands.
Because again, like Answering Machine, video players were this big, the cameras were this big, and it would cost a fortune to kind of produce and edit it, whatever. It was, and I didn't really have a show, that I could even videotape, I just wanted the job. So I'm like bemoaning, I'm home bemoaning. Oh, again, blah, blah, blah. Now, a little backstory. 2 weeks earlier, a friend of mine was a second grade, third grade teacher and had asked me to come to her class to perform for her kids. And I did. I was there for half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever, juggling, doing magic as Giacomo the Jester, and I did a show for her kids. Okay. So I'm sitting home bemoaning that I don't have a video, and I see the mailman coming up the front steps, and I go out and get the mail, and there's a manila envelope there, and I open it up and take out all of these drawings by these 8-year-old kids of my show. And they were adorable. And these thank you notes of thank you. And all the letters are backwards and upside down and the drawings in crayon. And they're freaking adorable.
Yeah.
So I took them out and I'm reading them and I put them in another envelope and I send it to the World's Fair. And that got me the job because this guy Scott Tillery, had a kid that age. And he opened up my envelope and he thought this was the coolest thing in the world. And he handed them out to everybody in the office. And he goes to his boss and he says, listen, I know we don't have any idea what he does, but I want to hire him. So here's the deal. If he sucks, we'll fire him. But this is so cute, I want to hire him. So I got the job. And that was, and I consider that my first professional job, and I haven't had a straight job since. And what I did was, because there were exhibits from all over the world, I went to all these different pavilions and convinced someone in the pavilion to translate my show into that language and put it on a tape. So I got to do it in Germany. A couple of years later, I got to do the World's Fair in Seville, Spain.
Oh, wow.
In Spanish. Did my show in Spanish.
Was there one that, like, you got the wrong dialect on the tape, or was that Paulo?
Oh, no, that was me. I had somebody translate my show into Spanish for the World's Fair. And I'm on the plane. The guy sitting next to me is from Spain. And I go, would you listen to my show? Just, make a couple of little notes on pronunciation and corrections, a couple of little things, And so I go through the whole thing, and he's sitting there very patiently. And I get done, and he goes, that was great. It was really good. And if your audience is from Mexico, they're gonna love it. And I'm like, excuse me? This was Mexican Spanish. So he made 1,000,000 corrections on this script. And then I was able to
pull it off.
So,
again, very lucky.
Very lucky. And then I tried really hard to get 2015 a World's Fair in Milan. And I tried so hard to get a gig there, and I couldn't do it. I approached it from literally 4 different angles. I so wanted to do my show in Italian at the World's Fair, and I couldn't get it. World's Fairs, by this point, the internet, they'd really lost their cachet.
Yeah.
The internet kind of killed the need for this kind of confluence,
Right. People actually physically getting together.
Right. Just not necessary. And then I tried doing it to be the entertainment director at the U.S. Pavilion. Couldn't get that to work. I did everything. I remember contacting the guy who was the head of the U.S. Pavilion on LinkedIn and and then I tried, there was a town not far from there that was going to have their own thing. And I tried going, I just couldn't. I did go, and it was terrible. It really was not a very good World's Fair. You could see that it was sort of the last vestige. There was not the excitement, because they couldn't present things that were new
and fresh. Yeah.
When I did the World's Fair in 1982, I remember there were 3 things that were brand new in the world at the World's Fair. One of them was the Rubik's Cube.
Oh, really?
That had never been seen, and it was there. They had a giant Rubik's Cube there, and it was enormous. And it was a big deal, the Rubik's Cube. It's often cliche now, but that was a big deal at the time. The other thing, it was the first time a computer that was, probably the size of this trailer, 1982, that could convert. And thinking of it now, it's ridiculous. You could play notes on a piano, and it would display the notation on a screen.
Wow.
That was miraculous at the time. It was just, whoa. People would go, oh my God. And you could play the piano, whether you played the piano or not. And it would just display. And then you could play it back,
Right.
And it was like, whoa. It was, And the other thing, it was the first time that this had left Philadelphia, which is the first place it was introduced in the U.S., but now it was introduced to the world, Haagen-Dazs ice cream. And it was this funny name. It was created in New Jersey by a guy named Tim Malthus. It was the first
boutique
ice cream and really boutique food. The whole boutique market really came out from Haagen-Dazs ice cream. These were big things, but now, it's going to be online in 2 seconds. It's going to be on TikTok in a split second. So you just don't need a World's Fair anymore.
This has been the Ren Faire History Podcast presented by Digital Ren Faire. I am Jonathan Crocker of the Wyld Men and Theater in the Ground, and you can find me at Facebook pages under both those names, as well as moremud.com and wildman.com.
And you can find me, Giacomo the Jester, or Carl Asch on Facebook, You can find me at renadventures.com. You can find me at emptyhats.com. Ciao, tutti!